Hello, welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Where does one draw the line between a subject of a monarchy who happens to live in a colony and an independent citizen of a state that owes its allegiance to a foreign monarch? That's a relatively simple question when you're talking about a subjugated people, the Belgian Congo or French Indochina or British India. There are ethnic and cultural and economic and linguistic distinctions between the colonists and the colonized there. But what about in America? Not just the U.S., but the entirety of the Americas, where a large part of the local indigenous people were either killed or chased off, and most of the people living within the colony were imports from the homeland. Where do we draw the line between a British colonist in America and an American? Or a Spanish colonist in Mexico and a Mexican? I mean, was George Washington British until July 4th, 1776? Well, technically, yeah, but that's not really the whole story, is it? I heard a discussion on the radio recently that informs that question. It was about the people of Latin America and what is the proper thing to call them, specifically surrounding the word Hispanic. Many people dislike that term, considering their colonial history with Spain or Hispania. And I, being the essentially self-centered person that I am, applied that to my own experience. I thought about how I would feel if someone called me or one of my fellow Americans Britannic. I'd probably tell them to go to hell. Not because I hate the British or anything. I like Doctor Who and Monty Python and Lord of the Rings. But I like Ron Swanson too, and I'm decidedly not British. So, I kind of get it. Generally speaking, in that case, the preferred nomenclature these days is Latin American, Latino, or Latina. So where is that line drawn between Spanish and Mexican? Is it with the Revolution? Or were those revolutions, the Spanish and American and many others on this hemisphere, were they merely a symptom of a change that had already taken place in the colonial holdings of Imperial Europe? This question is particularly relevant when it comes to the Spanish characters we introduced last time, and one character we danced around. However, today we're not really going to continue with their story. We're not going to talk about that until next time. Instead, we need to introduce a couple of ideas. Ideas relevant to our current story of the Cygnet and their Spanish captives, but they're bigger than that. They're ideas that involve our entire story of pirates and piracy. They're going to become even more important as we move on. And those ideas are going to raise questions of loyalty and nationality and betrayal. And I think they're going to muddy the waters when questions of guilt arise, perhaps not in a court of law, but in the hearts and minds of the pirates themselves. This is episode 134, The Hydrarchy. Those ideas are immediately applicable to our story, so I want to begin where we left off last time. The crew of the Cygnet, after a 3-hour sea battle, captured the Spanish-Philippine frigate Aranzazu. The Aranzazu was the third capture of the Cygnet on the 4th of March, 1687. Their first was a sampan, a smallish boat owned by Don Francisco Arzaga, carrying a modest amount of valuable cargo. Arzaga, his family, his manservant, and the sailors on board were all captive aboard the Cygnet. The second prize taken was a bark that carried maybe 50 sailors and was hauling rice and cotton. That crew was currently held captive aboard their own bark, guarded by a skeleton crew of pirates. The third, and by far the most relevant, was the Aranzazu. That ship and her crew are so interesting because, well, in part because of what we're going to talk about today. But also because some members of her crew will wind up wrecked on the coast of the Yucatan, carrying pirated English cargo, and one of them will write a document about his experience. In the immediate aftermath of the capture of Aranzazu, the English pirates set about bringing all of their captives over to the Cygnet. Now remember, Cygnet wasn't a large ship. It could comfortably carry a crew of around 100 sailors, and currently had a crew that was nearing that number, but adding somewhere in the range of 80 prisoners was beginning to push it a bit. And I wonder what something like that might look like. We can imagine that Don Francisco and his family were currently locked in, maybe, in John Reed's cabin. It certainly would have been the most comfortable accommodations and secure, and the family said that they were treated well on board the pirate vessel. From there, we can picture the officers of the Cygnet. They were standing on the poop deck and forecastle, the fore and aft of the ship, that would have elevated them above their captives. The rail would be guarded by stern-eyed pirates, and the deck would be filled with sitting or kneeling Spanish sailors, some of them bloody, many of them with their hands bound. And all of them, I imagine, would be warily eyeing the many muskets that were pointed in their direction. That is, at least when they weren't focused on the quarterdeck, where all of the action would have been focused here. The quarterdeck, sitting below the poop deck but above the main deck, was usually the home of the mainmast. And that spot on most ships in the Age of Sail held a kind of fearful reverence in the minds of many sailors. It was that mast that held the sails to catch the wind and carry them to their destination, but it was also the site of many a punishment on a king's ship or a merchantman. When a sailor stood before the officers of a ship to be judged, he stood before the mast. And today, that was where judgment would be reached as well, before the mast of the pirate ship Cygnet. But as I said, we're going to hold off on talking about that, because we need to talk about those concepts I mentioned earlier to understand what's to come. I'm trying to tell the story of piracy in as linear a fashion as possible, to showcase the evolution of pirates and pirate life, as well as many of the greater cultural shifts that are taking place here. Thus far, that's been relatively simple. We've been talking during the Buccaneer era mostly about privateers, state-sanctioned pirates that adhered to certain norms within the naval traditions of Europe. And we've seen some glimmers of the coming revolution, many of them quite bright glimmers. We've got the institution of ship's codes on buccaneer vessels in the Brethren of the Coast. But today we need to look at another pirate tradition, a cherished tradition that will come to define and represent the terror of Europe and the dread of nearly every ship's officer in the world: the distribution of justice. The distribution of justice walks hand in hand with another, less solid but even perhaps more important concept, and that's the Hydrarchy. The original definition of Hydrarchy, before it was appropriated by pirates, was simply the organized system of customs and laws, both written and unwritten, that governed the life of men at sea. It's kind of always existed in one form or another, ever since human beings began sailing. There were codes of conduct and superstitions and almost a distinct language among sailors. And, sailors are a different breed than the rest of us, a little dirty and a little romantic. But think about what that would mean in the Age of Sail, the 17th through 19th centuries or so. I mean, look at the 5 largest powers in the Age of Sail: England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. None of them were large countries. However, they expanded into these global empires that spanned every continent on the globe, and they did so almost exclusively through sea power. For example, in 1629, English vessels shipped 115,000 tons of cargo. Less than 50 years later, by the time of our story in 1686, they had tripled that number to around 350 tons annually. Think about what that would take. Materials in untold quantities: iron, bronze, timber, pitch, cotton. Think about the mobilization towards skilled manufacturing to turn those materials into barrels and guns and gunpowder, into ships. And then think about what it would take to sail them. That was an army of people on the ocean for any nation. And I'm not talking about Alexander's forces here. I'm talking about Napoleon's nation at war, on the sea. Tens of thousands of sailors for any given nation, hundreds of thousands of sailors all told. And that took time. It didn't happen overnight. It took generations, in fact. England or Portugal or the Netherlands was far too small to field that many sailors at once. You had to found colonies and wait for the people there to produce a new generation of seamen before you could mobilize the tens of thousands of mariners necessary to rule the world. And these mariners were extremely skilled people in a variety of different trades. Obviously the sailing, but they were at the same time merchants and smiths and carpenters and seamstresses and ambassadors and soldiers. These hundreds of thousands of sailors were the backbone of the early modern world for decades, for centuries even. And yet, while they may have pledged their allegiance to England or Spain or wherever they came from, they were all citizens of a different nation. They adhered to certain social norms of their home country, but they also adhered to the customs of the sea, to their superstitions and their codes of conduct. The Hydrarchy. Let's look for a second at the very word hydrarchy. It's a fusion of Greek words, hydro, Greek for water, and archy, for a system of rule. It's the same construction of a word like monarchy, the rule of one, or anarchy, the absence of rule. A hydrarchy is a civilization of people ruled by the sea. That word was coined in English in a pamphlet by a parliamentarian in the run-up to the English Civil War. His name was Richard Braithwaite, and he was a condescending, upper-class aristocrat. He said of English sailors at the time, quote, "Stars cannot be more faithful in their society than these mariners are in their fraternity. They will relate their adventures with wonderful terror. Necessary instruments are they, and instruments of a main importance in that hydrarchy wherein they live, for the state could not subsist without them." End quote. But what Braithwaite was saying there, while it sounds very much like praise, and it almost is, well, when he mentions their fraternity, he's talking about their kinship with one another, not necessarily their adherence to England. He viewed these sailors as important tools, sure, but unseemly, filthy, barbarous, and uncouth tools, the opposite of his Cromwellian Puritan ideals. A necessary evil, perhaps, but one that had to be reined in. Braithwaite's proposal, and the idea of many in the Cromwellian regime, was going to be to mold these sailors, mold the hydrarchy from the top down, to impose a new, civilized, and righteous hydrarchy from above. This was incredibly stupid. Do you recall the Puritan pirates of the Providence Company back in 1631? No drinking, no sex, no gambling, no singing. The boring pirates. Remember how they all died horribly? That's a reasonable example of the Puritan attempt to institute a new hydrarchy, and it failed terribly. But the basic premise there, the idea of reining in the baser instincts of the sailing class and reaffirming their allegiance to the home country, marched on, not just in England, but all across Europe. All of the horrors that we know from royal ships and merchant vessels stems from that very idea, a need to control the backbone of old Europe. And we've seen the blowback from that time and time again. It's the subject of this show, really. However, the reaction to Cromwellian and Stuart naval practices in regard to the Hydrarchy podcast doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But what was the Hydrarchy? Unfortunately, really specific definitions are harder to pin down, and they changed over time. we could look at the pseudo-religious beliefs of many a sailor in the age of sail. For example, they had the belief that one should never kill an albatross, which of course was broken in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. There are proverbs such as, "Red sky at night, sailors' delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning." Sometimes considered a bit of wild sailor superstition, but it does actually have some basis in meteorological fact, and was pretty reliable, still is in fact. There was, for example, the practice that Alexander Exquemelin described in the Buccaneers of America's first chapter, when he talks about sailors who had never crossed the Tropic of Cancer, or the Tropic of Capricorn, or one or another landmark that was important to sailors at the time, and how they had to undergo a sort of a baptism. Not a religious baptism, although it did have many of the forms of a traditionally religious baptism. It was a baptism of the sea, and oftentimes they were dunked into the sea. There were superstitions around St. Elmo's fire. There was a widespread belief in mermaids, and those had no real basis in reality. But then there was something like the belief that cats brought good luck to a ship. And that's just good sense. Cats ate rats, and rats carried plague and ate your food and were a menace. So you wanted to ensure that your ship would have cats on board. Of course, on the other hand, a ship entirely without rats was likely cursed as well. There were superstitions about singing or whistling into the wind. There were superstitions about women on board and Friday the 13th, and an untold number of other practices that sailors across the world, even if they didn't really believe, they still adhered to. I don't think that knocking on wood actually does me any good, but I do it all the same. Which by no means amounted to a dogmatic, doctrinal religion, but it was something that many sailors took very seriously. And then there were rules about how to treat other people on the sea, regardless of nationality or allegiance. How you should, maybe not if you were at war, but in general, pick up or tow stranded sailors. How if you saw a ship that was becalmed, you should make sure that no one was starving, as long as your own ship had enough to spare. And that leads to all of the pseudo-governmental stuff. The almost democratic way of making decisions on board. Their ways within the crew of dealing with theft or of breaking the rules or of incompetence. Not quite laws. The laws were handed down from above by the officers, but customs that were strictly adhered to. And the further away one got from home, the more those customs were adhered to. The proper Hydrarchy, not the Puritan, Cromwellian version, but the actual rule of the sea, flourished in parts of the world that were far removed from the halls of power. For example, the West Indies, Jamaica, Tortuga, places where the buccaneers invented their own codes of conduct, but really they weren't inventing new codes of conduct, they were merely codifying the Hydrarchy as each ship's crew saw fit. However, once they began to take it even more seriously, sometimes to write down their codes of conduct, and when they began to vote on them, and see them not as a loose affiliation of ideas, but as a way of life, that's when the Hydrarchy began to become a real threat to the kings and princes and popes of the old world. And that's not an image that we're often given of what pirates are. A society of rules and beliefs. That's not sleek or handsome or sexy or exciting. It's not men with pencil-thin mustaches fencing like prep school elites, nor is it whatever Johnny Depp was doing. Instead, it's revolutionary. And it might not have the high-minded philosophy of later revolutionary movements, but it's got a lot more dangerous ideas than what we might consider familiar European peasant revolts. Think about that scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, in which King Arthur comes across a peasant who informs the king that Arthur is not his king. He didn't vote for him. He's a member of an anarcho-syndicalist commune. And that's a great scene. Aside from the spectacular dialogue, it's funny because those ideas didn't exist in Arthurian England. But of course, peasants did revolt from time to time. Those revolts were usually ended quickly by a bunch of knights riding out from the castle and brutally murdering everyone involved. But what happens when the revolting peasants had the same tools as the lords and knights that would have put them down? When they had ships that were faster and often better armed, that gave their revolts room to breathe and time to fester. Their ideas could evolve and take root, and they could become fully realized norms to which all of the pirates adhered. In fact, those ideas, some of their norms, became part of the very definition of what a pirate was. Which brings us to the most loved and most feared, and perhaps the most iconic practice of all the pirates, the distribution of justice. Now, how widespread this practice actually was in the late 17th century is disputed. It was a time of changing norms and may not have been as prominent as it would later become under, say, the Nassau pirates. But it did happen, quite often. It happened on March 4th, 1687, on board the Cygnet. What it is simple. When a crew of pirates captured a ship, they would take everyone on board prisoner. And then they would ask the expected questions of their prisoners. Who are you? Where are you going? Do you have any rum? Do you have any gold? Do you have any information that might lead us to rum and or gold? But then they came round to the distribution of justice, and that took a bit longer. The officers had probably already been identified and were probably already tied to the mast or in the brig or in shackles. Were you one of the regular crew members, one or another of these pirates would take you aside and interrogate you. But don't picture a good cop, bad cop routine. This was a good cop routine. The pirate was ingratiating himself with you. He wanted true answers. The pirate might ask you to identify the officers, but that would be solely for verification and maybe to see if you were telling the truth, to see if perhaps you were the sort of person who would lie to protect one of your friends in the officer corps. Then the pirate would ask about your treatment at the hand of the officers and about life aboard the ship. Were the officers cruel? Were they stupid? Did they beat you often? And if they did, for what kind of offense? Did you get enough to eat on board? What about your wages? And then finally, would you like to keep sailing with those officers, or would you like to come with us? If the crew gave answers that pleased the pirates, if they were not beaten for frivolous offenses, if they were given enough to eat, if they were paid fair wages, then they would often just let the ship go. Perhaps a little lighter of cargo, but that's the price of doing business with pirates around. But if the captain was fair and just, he could keep his life, he could keep his command, he could keep his ship, and usually his crew. If one or another of the crew members, a competent crew member, wanted to go with the pirates, they were usually taken, or if the pirates needed a carpenter or a cook or a surgeon, they might kidnap that officer. But in most cases, if the crew wanted to sail with their commander, they were allowed to continue doing so. But on the other hand, if the answers that the crew gave were less pleasing to the pirates, that's when the pirates, and the crewmen who had made the complaint, that's when they got to have some fun. Maybe the captain was a little too free with the cat-o'-nine-tails. Perhaps he took a bit too much pleasure in binding a man to the mast and thrashing him, sometimes until blood streamed onto the deck and the man passed out or even died. Or maybe the captain was in the habit of garnishing wages or rations for minor infractions. If the crew looked malnourished or showed signs of scurvy, at least while the officers looked hale and healthy, or if crewmen alleged that they had been given the worst jobs in a fashion that the crew deemed to be unfair, then the officers were judged. Now, we may be tempted to picture the goriest and most horrific punishments imaginable, real eye for an eye kind of vengeance, maybe literally, taking someone's eye out, torture and murder while surrounded by cackling red-eyed pirates. After all, look at the aftermath of the French Revolution during the Terror, or look at the early Soviet Union. Revolutionaries are rarely kind to their oppressors. And deep down, I think we all kind of get that, right? Our delicate modern sensibilities might wince at some of the brutality, we might cover our eyes, but you would definitely peek, wouldn't you? And pirates are some of the most feared villains in all of world history, so it must have been truly terrible. Just clutch your pearls here. But the distribution of justice often looked a lot more like justice. It could be harsh, to be sure, but it was a harsh time. However, it was usually fair. And I'll admit that I'm indulging in a wee bit of generalization here. Not all crews were created equal. Some relished the chance to murder any ship's officer and took that chance as often as possible. But most pirate crews were regular humans. They may have had grievances, but they didn't want to see innocent people punished unnecessarily. So when they distributed justice, they tried to do it fairly. The pirates usually only punished those who they saw as deserving of it. For example, they wouldn't punish all of the officers for the sins of a few. They would exact justice on those who, according to the crew, really deserved it. However, the captains often fared poorly in this situation. Captains were usually seen as responsible for the actions of their officers, and even if they didn't indulge in, say, ordering whippings or doing them themselves, they often shared in the retribution. It was in the end their responsibility. And the punishments were not all horrific torture followed by slow death. They could be, absolutely. For the officers guilty of the worst infractions, they might turn to something like keel hauling. In case you're unfamiliar, you should listen to our episode on torture, or I'll give a brief rendition of what it is. Imagine being bound, your hands together and your feet together, and then having those bindings tied to a very long rope that is wrapped around the ship. And then the crew pulls the rope taut, with you as the linchpin, around the ship, and begins to pull. You are dragged over the side and down into the water, perhaps your back against the hull of the vessel, dragging against all of the barnacles and rough wood and splinters. They begin to cut into your back, all the while you are holding your breath, trying not to scream, as gashes begin to be filled with salt water. It was a truly terrible type of punishment. However, it took a lot of work and a lot of time, and pirates would rarely employ this unless you had been judged deserving of it. Men were certainly executed in various fashions for different infractions, but for lesser crimes they might receive only a lashing. It could be a truly brutal lashing. You might receive, if you were a particularly bad captain or officer, 10 or 15 lashes from every crewman who clearly remembered all of the strokes that they had received at the officer's hand. And they might die, but they might live. And if the crew decided that they were not worthy of death, they might give him a reprieve. The pirates might oversee the taking of an eye or a finger or a leg, especially if one of their actions had led to a crewman's loss of a corresponding appendage. Other times, an officer, or an entire officer corps, were they all guilty, might be marooned. And arguably that is torture and a slow death, but they might be saved. Much more common, though, perhaps the most common punishment meted out in the distribution of justice, was shame. Imagine that you were a middle-class English merchant in Port Royal, say, or maybe you're an upper-class lady in India, or maybe you're a French farmer who has made his way into town for the weekend. But you're down at the docks, and you hear a ruckus near the water. You turn to see what all the trouble is, when you spot what everybody is looking at, a small boat approaching the wharf. And then on board you see quite a sight. Maybe a dozen men, all of them completely nude and terribly sunburned, except their faces, because their heads are guarded by their very, very fine officers' hats. However, that is the only protection they have from the elements. They're rowing as hard as they can, but they look weak and tired. But then you recognize them. Those are the officers from the Royal Adventurer or whatever. Officers who marched around town weeks before, all self-importance and bravado and arrogance, but look at them now. Imagine those sunburned, completely nude officers climbing ashore, trying to hide their nakedness until, finally, a unit of guards comes rushing down with sailcloth maybe to cover them up and to usher them as quickly as possible into the fort. There might be some sympathy, but there might also be some laughter. And of course that would be all hushed up in polite society, but the taverns in town would be roaring with the tale of these posh fops bested by the likes of Ed Teach or Black Bart Roberts for weeks. In fact, speaking of Black Bart Roberts, he had an official dispenser of justice on board, a crew member named George Wilson, who was chosen as a sort of judge for the crews they captured. George Wilson personally decided guilt and punishment, although it was usually given out by the crew. Imagine what you would think if you were the captain of a merchant vessel, say, making a run to the West Indies in 1718. You would be fully aware of this practice. You may have, as a crewman, seen the distribution of justice when pirates captured a vessel you were working on. How would you treat your crew? Even if it's very unlikely, with the possible threat of torture and murder at the hands of a buccaneer crew hanging over your head, wouldn't you think twice before ordering one of your crewmen lashed? Wouldn't you try to ensure that justice was actually carried out on your vessel rather than harsh, unduly harsh punishment? There is a question as to whether the pirates had the right to distribute justice. I mean, what gives them the right to do so? They certainly weren't ordained by God or any state power. They weren't ordained by any sort of democratic mandate of the people. They were villains of all nations. They had no right to do so. But they took that right because they lived in a time when the regular people had no rights either. If they were to take them from those in power, they had to do so by force, which is exactly what the pirates did. Now, whether they were morally justified in doing so, well, that's a question we will all have to answer in our own hearts. But for my money, I'm tempted to say yes, but I can't across the board. As I said, there were pirates who tortured and murdered officers without actually dispensing justice. What they were after was revenge. There were others who arguably just enjoyed watching them hurt. And on that level, the Hydrarchy begins to break down. Those customs and norms that had been adhered to for generations began to fall apart among the pirates. They began to build their own Hydrarchy, their own pseudo-governmental structure that was so outside the norms of anything in the civilized world that it began to look very unlike civilization indeed. Moving forward, we will occasionally talk about the distribution of justice, if it's particularly interesting or particularly relevant for some reason. But even when we don't, we need to remember that from here on out, it happens almost every time that a ship is captured by a pirate crew. When they capture the Whydah, or the Ganji Sawai, or any of an untold number of unnamed cotton or sugar ships, the pirates judged and distributed justice upon those who they had captured. Next time, we're going to take an in-depth look at our first distribution of justice, as it took place on board the Cygnet on the 4th of March, 1687. We spent a lot of last time talking about ideas, concepts essential to the world of the pirates. Those ideas were threefold. First was the Hydrarchy, an amalgamation of superstitions and customs and laws that govern the life of men at sea. I called it the rule of the sea. Second was the distribution of justice, which will concern us today. That was a tradition particular to pirates in which a captured ship's officers were judged. Were they found to be cruel or incompetent, they could face anything from keel hauling to marooning, among many lesser punishments. And then I raised a question that I neglected to answer. When does someone stop being a colonial subject and start being a citizen beholden to a foreign power? When does a citizen of colonial Mexico stop being Spanish and start being Mexican? Now, there's no definitive answer to that question, but I wanted to introduce that before we discuss the Hydrarchy. However, today we're going to explore that question in a little bit more depth. Today we're talking about a host of Spanish subjects, colonials, provincials, who were facing that very question. Were they loyal Spaniards, or were they instead Mexicans, Peruvians, or Panamanians, or Filipinos? And they're going to be presented with that question by a crew of dangerous English buccaneers. This is episode 135, The Distribution of Justice. To begin, let's refresh exactly where we are and what is happening. We're off the northern coast of Capones Island, in the Philippines, in a shipping lane bound for Manila. The date is March 4th, 1687. Right now it's about 7 or 8 in the evening. The pirate ship Cygnet has captured 3 ships that day. First, a small sampan, the personal craft of Don Arsaga, carrying a few valuable goods but in small quantities. Then there's a bark carrying rice with 50 or so sailors on board, and the single-deck frigate Aranzazu with 25 mariners and a cargo of cotton and iron. Now, we already know the makeup of the Cygnet's crew. John Reed as captain, Josiah Teat, the ship's master, Henry Moore, quartermaster, and William Dampier as navigator. But they aren't the focus of today's episode, beyond their role in taking prisoners. William Dampier mentions the taking of these ships, but only in passing, so he's no help. Instead, we're going to focus on the captured sailors themselves. We're able to do so because we have several other sources from which to draw. There was the testimony of a man named Assam, a Malay pirate who joined up with the crew of Cygnet. There's also the testimony of Bartolome Luis, a sailor who was captured back in Mexico and was there that day. And there are other testimonies, a few of them given by Englishmen, which are relevant here, and I am using them, but I'm not going to tell you about them. At least not yet. That would give the story away. But then, perhaps most importantly, there is the story told by the Spanish captain of Aranzazu. He was kind enough to write down his experiences, but he did so only after being captured carrying a wealth in English materials on board a stolen ship. And really, he's the focus of our episode. So let's begin with the story of Aranzazu's captain. His confession, or maybe his memoir, was until recently regarded as a fiction. These days, that opinion has been revised. It was not just some story invented by a clever author using a piratical pen name. We know that Daniel Defoe did that sort of thing, but this memoir appears to be at least a little true. However, to find that truth, we need to sift through his lies. The tale begins, quote, "My name is Alonzo Ramirez, and my native land is the city of San Juan in Puerto Rico, the capital of the island which separates the realms of the Atlantic Ocean from those of the Gulf of Mexico. It is celebrated as a stopping point for its delightful waters, which refresh those who, thirsty for New Spain, voyage from the old in search of the new." End quote. We need to take everything this guy has to say with a huge grain of salt. Even his name, Alonzo Ramirez, which is how we will refer to him, but even that might be a lie. Probably is a lie, in fact. However, he goes on to describe the virtues of Puerto Rico in some detail, before bemoaning the island's current poverty. That's what brought his father, Lucas de Villanueva, to Puerto Rico from Spain. His mother, on the other hand, Ana Ramirez, was a native-born mestizo woman. But that does bring up our initial question. She was the child of a white Spaniard and a Native American. That means that Alonzo himself had a little Native American blood. Alonzo never saw Spain. All he had were tales from his distant and often absent father. Ana Ramirez, on the other hand, had other tales that had been passed down through generations, through her own mother and grandmother, about Puerto Rico, about Alonzo's home. He had tales from his native ancestors that had lived there for centuries. And I wonder, growing up, just how Spanish young Alonzo felt. By 12, he decided to leave home and the poverty there to find his fortune at sea. He writes, quote, "I took an opportunity in the shape of a flyboat belonging to Capitan Juan del Corco, Juan of the Cork, which was to sail from our port bound for La Habana in that year of 1675. It did not seem a burdensome occupation, considering that I was finally living in liberty. Perhaps it presaged future calamities that I began my search for fortune by taking to the sea on a cork." End quote. You know how people sometimes say they wished that they could live in this or that historical era? Ooh, I wish I was a Roman, or I wish I lived in Victorian London, or maybe some of you have thought about being a pirate. It's always a bad idea, in every case. There's no plumbing most of the time. You have to deal with plague and a lack of modern medicine. There's usually going to be horrific oppression of one kind or another. Leeches. You have to deal with leeches. But worst of all, you have to deal with jokes like that. But Ramirez made it on his little cork and landed at Havana, then moved on to San Juan de Ulua. You may remember that as the town at which Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins were betrayed by the Spanish, where they were attacked for selling stolen human cargo. But Ramirez didn't stay there long. He took work on a mule train that was headed toward Mexico City. At Mexico City, though, life was difficult. He very nearly starved to death, and he was rebuffed, looking for employment, by a respectable relative who wanted nothing to do with rabble like Ramirez. He kicked him out. But finally he did find work. He got a job on a merchant train, really just him and the merchant, who were going to be taking goods from Mexico City down south to buy vanilla and cocoa and cotton and cochineal. It was a good enough job, but his boss, an elderly man, died en route. However, Ramirez finished the job and returned to Mexico City with both the body and all of the goods. The merchant's family was appreciative of this, and that led to a marriage with Francisca Xavier, a prosperous young woman who was related to the former bishop of Mexico City. Unfortunately, Francisca died in childbirth along with their child, and Ramirez despaired. I should note that he appears to have despaired more for his sudden drop in social station than for the loss of his loving wife. Following her death, he booked passage from Acapulco to Manila on board the Santa Rosa. He writes, quote, "I became disabused of the notion that I would ever ascend beyond the level of my social sphere, although I still resented that many men with fewer merits were able to reach the highest. I gave up on my plans. There is much abundance in these islands, especially offered by Manila. Trade is ordinarily of the high seas sort. Through this occupation, I not only trafficked in commerce, but also saw many cities and ports in the East Indies." End quote. So he traveled to the Philippines, where he took job as a merchant at sea. But he's a little vague about all of that, about his employment and his voyage to Asia. And that's kind of odd. Consider the many details and names he's given us so far. We know about his mother and father. He gave us a great description of Puerto Rico. We know the names of 3 of his bosses, and we know about the goods that he traded for on that fateful mission. And remember, this isn't a memoir of his entire life. This is a story about how he was captured by pirates. So why do we know so much about his early life, but virtually nothing about his time in the Philippines? Note how he takes pains to mention his disillusionment with Spanish society, his frustration with a social order that kept people like him, people who had merit but of non-European ancestry, from advancing in society. You might remember those exact same frustrations in the story of Diego the Mulatto. That was what led him to piracy some 40 years earlier. They were similar to those of the Spanish-Philippine Malay pirate Assam, who was currently on board the Cygnet. All 3 of them were Spanish subjects who grew so tired of the restrictive social system in Spanish lands that they decided to turn against their home nation to piracy in a bid for revenge. Or rather, Ramirez wasn't a pirate, he was just a good, God-fearing merchant. But that brings us up to date with his version of the story, until that one fateful mission on which Alonzo Ramirez and his ship Aranzazu were captured by the pirates on board Cygnet. Ramirez gives a relation of the distribution of justice. He writes, quote, "Knowing that I commanded the vessel they had just captured, they transferred me onto the larger of their 2 ships, to which their captain welcomed me with deceitful amiability. The very first words he uttered were a promise of freedom if I revealed to him the names of the wealthiest places on these islands." End quote. Ramirez decided to lie to who he thought was the captain of the pirates. He told his interrogator that he was new to the region and knew nothing. But he's also lying to us here. All of the other sources which mention this at all contradict Ramirez, and they also suggest that either he or Dampier was lying later on. It appears that Ramirez was not the captain of Aranzazu, nor was he first questioned. What was he, then? A middling officer, maybe a bosun, maybe even lower. But I picture him as sort of a Long John Silver character. A crewman minding his own business throughout the day, but then come the hours after dark. Once the sun set, he spent his time whispering secret plans to certain like-minded members of the crew. Plans to take the ship by force, to kill the officers, and to sail out as marauders, vengeful against anyone and everyone who had ever wronged them. Now all of that, not the Long John Silver stuff, but the him not being captain stuff, comes from those later testimonies. They listed a different captain for the Aranzazu, but one of them does suggest that Ramirez belonged to a sect within the crew which was rambunctious. The second contradiction, and this is really confusing stuff, regards the crew of Cygnet. Ramirez immediately gets all of the names wrong. Now that could be explained if the crew was using aliases, which isn't a bad plan should you be captured later on, but it is highly frustrating for our purposes. However, that's the less likely option. The more likely answer to this question involves a lot of very deep factors, differences between Spanish and English naval customs and naming conventions, as well as some linguistic quirks that are particular to late 17th century Spanish. I'm not going to get into all of that. I don't understand most of that. I will point out the possibility that it could have been Ramirez just lying to protect his comrades in arms much later on. He could have been purposefully confusing the capture of his ship with that of the rice bark. There are some chroniclers who argue that there was no other rice bark, and Ramirez was merely lying about being the captain of a third ship, that the rice bark was in fact the Aranzazu. But that's difficult to discern. For now, we should move on with Ramirez's version of events. We know pretty conclusively that he was on board the Cygnet, and that at one point one of the pirates did get around to questioning him. That was the distribution of justice. Sadly, for our exciting narrative, this particular distribution was less than a brutal retribution on the high seas. The crews of all three vessels were interrogated, but they had very little of interest to say. They warned that Manila was too well defended for the pirates, and they did mention that a treasure ship, a Manila galleon, was sailing out from Manila Harbor, but it was empty. It was going to be picking stuff up. It wouldn't become a valuable target for several months yet. None of them had any particular horrors to recount about the officers on board, so there was really very little distribution of justice. For the time being, though, the pirates had to deal with a much more pressing situation. They had a ship full of captives. They had previously burned the sampan, but what were they going to do with the rice bark and the frigate Aranzazu? Were the situation a little bit different, they might have just let them go, with their crews intact. But that wasn't an option here. Both ships would immediately rush to the nearest city, probably Manila, and they would raise the alarm, which would raise a fleet which would come out and kill the pirates. They needed at least a little time to get away. Instead of letting them go, after a few hours' questioning and debate, the pirates came up with a plan. First of all, they unloaded all of the guns and the tools from the bark. Some of it they loaded onto the Cygnet. The rest they loaded onto Aranzazu. Then the pirates set to disposing of their captives, in, the most humane way available to them. They decided to ferry prisoners over to the shores of a nearby island. The Arsaga family, as well as his sailors, and the whole crew of that rice bark were ferried over to shore. Not only them, but most if not all of the Spanish captives taken in Peru and Panama and Mexico. And then the pirates did something odd. They left these Spaniards on shore with tools and water and nearly all of the rice. They took some to refill their stores, but most of it they left with these people on shore. They weren't being marooned. They weren't sentenced to a slow starvation. They were left ashore, but they had food and water, and they were in, and this is key, they were in the busiest shipping lane in the region. In a few days' time, a ship would find them, and these poor captives could return home safe and sound and well-fed, with an exciting tale of having been captured by pirates. They even left the bark mostly intact. Yeah, they stripped her of sail and ropes, and eventually they cut her adrift, but both the ship and her crew were eventually found and put back to work. This wasn't a punishment. This was merely the pirates' solution to get all of their Spanish prisoners out of their hair, make sure they didn't have to feed them, and get out of there without anybody being the wiser, for at least a few days. I know this isn't the bloodthirsty yarn that we might be hoping for, but honestly, we need to get used to that. Pirates were people. They hated seeing women and children and their fellow mariners suffer, most of them at least. But what happened to the Aranzazu and her crew? Let us assume that Ramirez was telling the truth about the Aranzazu carrying cotton and iron on an errand for the governor. Let us assume that Ramirez was not, in fact, a pirate on his own ship who happened to cross the Cygnet here in this busy shipping lane. We'll assume that for the moment, at least. And let us even assume that he was not the Spanish Long John Silver and was, in fact, the captain of Aranzazu. The captain, for whatever reason, says nothing of the peaceful transport of Spanish civilians safely to shore with plenty of food. The story of a regional dignitary, Arsaga, the story of his family, and the tale of reputable sailors on board the rice bark all confirm that part of the story, but Ramirez leaves it out. Instead, this reputable captain, who was caught with a stolen ship carrying stolen goods only after his ship was wrecked on the coast of the Yucatan, bemoans his terrible fate, his fate at the hands of the pirates. In his totally believable story, we get all of the horrific bloodshed and menace that we might crave in a good pirate tale. Ramirez and his men were tortured by the bloodthirsty, nefarious, English, Protestant, vile, heathen barbarians. At one point, when a particularly recalcitrant prisoner refused to give out even his name, a good, brave, loyal, honest Spanish Catholic, after he kept his mouth shut, the pirates pulled their sabers. They advanced on the prisoner and cut him limb from limb. Literally, they chopped him into bits. Imagine this pack of wild pirates tearing at this poor soul's clothes, snarling and chopping and slicing while blood and gore fly into the air. Then, their prize disassembled, the pirates turned to the other prisoners. They were literally dripping in what had formerly been inside their dear beloved friend, and then the pirates began to feast. Each of the pirates, with his own slice of the poor Spaniard, began to gnaw and bite and chew the raw flesh and swallow. You can hardly imagine the terror and the disgust and the shock, and one could understand in those circumstances, in the face of this kind of horrific barbarity, why the crew of Aranzazu, who had for some reason that we are not given been chosen for tonight's menu rather than set ashore alongside the other prisoners, why they were forced to meekly comply and join the pirates of the Cygnet. Of course, all of that is true. That definitely happened. Not a word of it happens to have been falsified by Ramirez or made up by me. Yep, hard historical fact, all of that. I mean, you can see why this was assumed to have been a complete fiction for so long. It was written years after the fact in Mexico City. None of the names are right. None of them are verifiable to pirates that were operating in the region. And then you have stuff like that tale of cannibalism that's just so over the top that it beggars belief. However, glimmers of truth do begin to pepper the narrative from here on out. Only a few of them, but enough that historians now generally agree that this is at least based on true events, kind of like how you see a horror movie based on true events that has nothing to do with the actual events, but there's something there, some real nugget of truth. And from here, we're going to deviate from the story of the Cygnet. We're going to stick close by the story of Alonzo Ramirez. Now, their stories are intertwined. After this act of horrific barbarity, the crew of Aranzazu joined up with the crew of Cygnet. Whether they did so due to a history or intent of piracy, or due to a wee bit of cannibalism, they joined. And their tale, the tale of the Cygnet from here on out, is a long story. It's too long for today's episode. And I thought about just blending the crew of Aranzazu into the tale, and they will be there for a while, but I want to finish Alonzo's story. I want to get to the root of those ideas that I brought up last time. I mean, it makes sense that Captain John Reed and the crew of Cygnet would free their other captives. It was the best solution to their problems. Whether or not the crew of the Aranzazu came willingly or were captured, the pirates had mouths to feed. They had 80 or 90 crewmen already, along with another 12 or 15 from the Malay pirates. They had to get rid of some of their prisoners. But now they had an additional 25 sailors, which leads to about a crew of 130, and that's a bit much for the Cygnet. They could have carried it on board, but it would have been a little cramped. However, all of a sudden, this nice, new, single-deck frigate, the Aranzazu, fell into their laps. Now, Dampier says nothing about taking this ship, but every other source mentions 2 frigates in the pirate fleet. And we need to suspect everything Dampier tells us from here on out, because his narrative begins to differ substantially from all of our other sources. This is probably due to Dampier covering his own tracks, legally speaking. The Aranzazu was crewed by pirates from among the Cygnet, possibly by members almost exclusively of her former crew, Ramirez and all of the rest. But it appears, and this is disputed still, that William Dampier was given command of the vessel. We'll look at that in significantly more depth next time, but it does kind of make sense. He did at least speak very good Spanish. However, we can be sure that Ramirez and his men and the Aranzazu were all together with the Cygnet. Those little nuggets of truth that I mentioned, well, they make that argument pretty conclusively. First of all, Ramirez mentions in passing that the English pirates bragged about their raids on Peru and Panama and Costa Rica. Fairly specifically, though. That's obviously an allusion to the Second Pacific Adventure and their raids on those lands. But even more convincing than that was the story of a Spaniard named Miguel. Miguel de Medina, a Sevillian, but that, kind of diminishes the mystique. Alonzo Ramirez calls him only simply Miguel. And Ramirez hated this man. However, Miguel was certainly not a fabrication. He was mentioned by Dampier and Ramirez and Assam and Uriarte and nearly everyone else who talked about this story. He was even mentioned by a group of familiar pirates who were operating in the Indian Ocean at the time. Pirates who we have met before, but we have yet to introduce into this tale. But that's how notable he was. Everyone noticed him. And that was due to a very distinct trait in Miguel. He was Spanish, proper Spanish, from Seville, but Miguel was Protestant. You don't meet a lot of Spanish Protestants, even today, even less in the 17th century. Miguel wasn't born Protestant, he was raised a Catholic in Spain, but here on the Cygnet he was seen many, many times celebrating Anglican holy days with the crew. He was a recent convert to Anglicanism, and as are many converts, he was very devout. He was in fact seen praying far more often than any of his comrades. However, he got his Anglicanism from the pirates. Miguel was picked up back in Mexico a little over a year ago by the crew of Cygnet. He might have been captured, but he might have gone willingly. Either way, he took to the marauder's life quickly and with real relish. He was already a sailor, he knew his business, but he embraced piracy even more than most of the other sailors on board. He was one of the most vocal members of that pirate sect back in Mindanao. We're led to believe that he hated Spain. However, we don't have his own thoughts on the matter. We don't know why he hated Spain, if that was even the case. What we do have are the words of Alonzo Ramirez. Ramirez describes all of the beatings and the forced labor and even some of the scare tactics that the pirates used on board Cygnet. For example, on one occasion, when the Spanish decided to strike and refused to do any work at all, the pirates took one of their number up on deck. The crew, the Spanish crew down in the hold, began to hear the most terrible sounds from above. There was awful, awful screaming. There were slashing sounds and thuds. And finally, when it grew quiet, blood began to drip through the deck and onto their heads. The pirates told them that their companion was dead and had been thrown into the sea, and that they would continue this practice with each and every last one of them, only they would grow more and more terrible, take longer and longer to kill the Spaniards until they decided to break their strike. So the Spaniards complied. They went back to work. But a few days later, there was their dead friend, unbruised, unbroken, and very much alive. By this point, the pirates had rearranged sleeping arrangements and work schedules so that they couldn't really strike anymore, but Ramirez reaches the conclusion that all of that terror that they had imagined above was merely a bit of play acting. Pirates throwing themselves to the deck and screaming in a Spanish accent in abject terror, and then he suggests the slaughter of a hog. Now that might have been cruel psychological torment, but Ramirez was most upset about the fact that they didn't even get to eat any of the hog. All that they got was rice, gruel, and stale water. Ramirez spends some time about their lack of good food, but then Alonzo Ramirez writes, quote, "I suspect that the evil of their manner was increased by a Spaniard in their company, a native of Seville, whose name was Miguel. No intolerable task given to us, no occasion for mistreatment or hunger enforced upon us, no threat to life sent our way ever came without his having had a hand in it. Miguel gloried in how these acts boldly pronounced to the world his godlessness, his abandonment of his native Catholic faith, and his commitment to living a pirate and dying a heretic." End quote. Lopez Lazaro, who wrote an excellent, detailed analysis of this whole episode, notes something very interesting about that passage. Lazaro writes, quote, "Ramirez told his Mexican audience that perfidious Albion was less to be feared than traitorous Spain." End quote. Looking at it from that point of view, one might begin to suspect that Ramirez was sneaking in a bit of cleverly disguised propaganda to his memoir. After their will was sufficiently broken, Ramirez and his men spent 2 years in the company of English pirates. There are going to be changes to the roster among those pirates that will concern us later on, but eventually Ramirez and the other Spaniards were returned, via an entirely different pirate ship, to the West Indies. According to his story, for the entirety of those 2 years, they were forced to work through torture and psychological torment. However, when we look at the construction of his narrative, there's something suspicious there. Ramirez tells us of his time under the pirates relatively briefly. Then he arrives in America. But then a new chapter begins, and he goes back to detail all of the horror that he experienced on board the Cygnet. It's almost as though someone, maybe a bishop or a governor there in Mexico, pointed out that there simply wasn't enough in his memoir to exonerate Ramirez. Maybe they told him to flesh out the horrific torture bits, and it's in that chapter, looking back, where he talks about the pantomime slaughter, and the cannibalistic pirates, and about Miguel. I mean, he tells us about a bunch of cannibals that ate someone, a friend of his, and then he goes on to say, "I suspect the evil of their manner was increased by a Spaniard." I mean, they just ate a guy. And Miguel is somehow worse than all of that? I mean, maybe. Miguel did abandon the Catholic faith, and maybe in the eyes of a loyal Catholic, that's worse than eating a guy. Or maybe Ramirez is hinting at his real-life feelings here. Treachery. Treachery is often considered the most egregious sin. In Dante's Inferno, in the 9th and lowest circle of hell, we see all of the traitors, including, notably, Judas Iscariot and Lucifer himself. And then this Puerto Rican, of some Arawak descent, well, he certainly had strong feelings about his mother country, Spain. A country that Ramirez felt, if we listen to his own personal account, had betrayed him. A feeling that he shared with Diego Lucifer and Assam, a feeling that was shared by many Spaniards of the day. It's almost as though Ramirez is saying that despite the cannibalism and all of the horrors of these English pirates, somehow Spain is still worse. A clever bit of doublespeak if that is the case. Those who might find themselves sympathetic to that point of view would likely see what he is saying by reading between the lines, while those who are loyal Spaniards likely wouldn't. But how did Ramirez get there? How did he get to the writing of the manuscript, I mean? Well, he tells us that the pirates, after a couple of years, decided to set him free. At the Windward Islands, they gave him a ship that was large enough to carry all of his men. But that's not all they gave him. They gave him a compass, and an astrolabe, and a Dutch wagoner, and tools, and ropes, and sailcloth, and pitch, and rice, and water, salted beef, raw salt, and a medicine box. Not to mention the sabers, and the muskets, and the pistols, and the powder, and the small shot, and the large shot, and the cannons. And oh yeah, there were the cargo holds that were absolutely filled with stolen iron and tin and bronze, metals straight from the East Indies that could have been sold in Port Royal, or in Petit Goave, or in Tortuga, or Nassau, or Boston. All of which, I might mention, were ports that the pirates who quote-unquote set Ramirez free were going to be visiting in the very near future. Why would they let this Spaniard go? Why would they let him have a ship of his own filled with valuable cargo? Why would they give him all of these tools? Why would they give him the weapons? What it looks like to anybody who's not an idiot is that this was a pirate ship complete with all of the implements necessary for piracy, as well as the pirated cargo on board. Am I saying that Alonzo Ramirez was a pirate? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, because he so very clearly was, despite his manuscript. But if we combine that truth with his own story, we can construct a pretty reasonable narrative of what happened to bring him to writing that story. Ramirez took part in a big raid, a raid which we will be talking about in the future, and then, like all of the other pirates, ran off to America to hide out. But in America things were different. There were certain tensions between the Spanish and the English and the French that weren't necessarily there in the same fashion in the East Indies. So he had to split up with his pirate brethren. However, on his way to a lightly populated part of the Spanish Main, probably the Mosquito Coast, he was spotted by an English fleet out of Jamaica. That's something he says himself. And that led him to flee, which led him into a storm that eventually dashed his ship upon the coast of the Yucatan. At that point, he and his crew disembarked, took their muskets, and marched inland, searching for people. They didn't find anybody, but the following morning, returning to their ship, they found a couple of Native Americans watching the ship. Now, Ramirez and his men surprised the natives. They jumped out with guns drawn, and the natives surrendered. They spoke to them in Spanish, however, and the natives relaxed, and then their boss showed up, the Spaniard who either owned or maybe employed them, to take them into town. Now, it wasn't a large town, but it did have people who could write to the local governor. That governor sent men to collect all of the goods from the ship and make a full accounting, which is why we know about the guns and the astrolabe and the compass and all that. And he sent word of all of that to the viceroy in Mexico City. The viceroy sent word that Ramirez and his men and all of the goods should be taken to Mexico City. The Spanish crew under Ramirez was taken in shackles because obviously they're pirates. But the viceroy was in a quandary here. Were he to prosecute Ramirez, which was the obvious choice, he would have to return the tin and the iron and the bronze. On the other hand, he could have a local bishop convince Ramirez to write up a mostly fictitious rendition of his adventures, a rendition that was filled with enough truths and half-truths to sing as honest, but to absolve himself of any crime. That would allow the governor to claim ignorance as to the source of the metals, to claim them for his own, and to use them in the war. Now this might seem slimy and corrupt, and it was, but it's not outside of the norm of the time. We've seen English governors from Port Royal do this kind of thing all the time. We've seen French governors at Tortuga and Petit Goave do this kind of thing, and we're about to see more of them doing that kind of thing. Because here, in 1689, at almost the end of the tale of Alonzo Ramirez, we are at the outbreak of the 9 Years' War in the West Indies. When we talk about the 9 Years' War, we are going to meet Alonzo Ramirez and his men. They're privateers at this point. We're going to meet them again. And we're also going to see some other old friends, the French and the Dutch privateers Michel-André Zun, Michel de Grammont, and Lauro de Graaf. But before we get to that part of the story, we need to bring the English up to date. We need to bring them up to 1689 in the West Indies. The Cygnet is part of that, certainly. Dampier and his lot have quite a road ahead of them before we get there. But we will also be reunited with a number of other names and faces we already know. Every military in the world, very nearly every nation-state, has very strict rules about allegiance and loyalty. And I know, where did he find that little nugget of historical wisdom? Perchance he pulled it from the Library of Alexandria, or maybe I found it in the journal, found in the cabin of the notorious pirate Captain Obvious. But work with me here. Loyalty. Loyalty builds a strong sense of camaraderie, and it can be used, should your nation go to war, to build an us versus them narrative. If, for example, an English person, say a prince, seemed poised to ally themselves with the Nazi party over in Germany, he is branded a traitor and removed from power. Clap the dust off your hands, no muss, no fuss, that's how it works. That's what loyalty is about. But that's what makes an organization like ISIS, really terrorist organizations in general, but ISIS in particular, that's what made them so worrying. Groups like that call for people to abandon their ties of loyalty. It's cause for alarm when young men from Syria and Iraq begin to slip away to join the new caliphate, but it's, hardly a surprise when that happens. When Muslims from the West see something attractive in that new caliphate and begin to slip away, that's when it becomes a concern. And it gets scary, especially to those in positions of power, when pretty white girls run away to join ISIS, people who were formerly not Muslim. There's a real sense that there's just something alluring or captivating to that new threat, something that those with power just don't understand and likely never will. It's a question of why. Why would somebody abandon the agreed-upon order? ISIS was pretty damn scary on their own, but war in the Middle East is the agreed-upon order. We've all grown used to it at this point. Suicide bombers blowing up mosques, well, that's awful, but it's hardly a threat to global security or world order. In that case, you sell a few more planes to Saudi Arabia, clap your hands, no muss, no fuss, that's how it works. But when it starts to get scary, in the case of ISIS, for example, when people who you would not expect to want to go join the caliphate begin to do so, that's when you send an army. And ISIS was pretty firmly dealt with. Pirates, though, often offered that same flavor of terror to those in power. I mean, when it's just a few drunks on rickety boats, it's not a major problem. Let them raid the Spanish. It's not our problem, that's the agreed-upon order, and we can sell a few more cannons to ship owners. When there seems to be a movement growing, that's when it becomes a concern. You see that with the Malay pirates, and the Greco-Roman pirates, and of course, the Golden Age pirates. In Rome, there was a Mithraic cult that was terrifying. It kept kidnapping and occasionally sacrificing Roman aristocrats. With the Malay, it became an independence, anti-imperialist movement. And in the case of the Brethren of the Coast, they were proto-democratic. And that's how all of those organizations became a threat to the agreed-upon order. That's when you send Pompey Magnus out to deal with them and basically create the Byzantine Empire. That's when you draft legislation that allows for extrajudicial executions, as they did in 1683. And when pretty white girls start leaving home and wearing boys' clothes and joining the pirates, well, that's when you send Woodes Rogers. At the end of the buccaneer era, the powers of Europe, primarily France and England, turned the Caribbean into a militarized zone. They did so in an effort to oust the growing pirate threat and to keep the peace there in the West Indies. After all, slaves and sugar were the way of the future, and that's good for business, which is, of course, good for everybody. Anybody who dissented to this idea or attempted to cause any trouble were rabble-rousers, and they were eliminated with the utmost prejudice. So the pirates, who were still alive, left. They left the West Indies to go everywhere else. Now, that actually happened twice, but we're at the cusp of the first of these, well, I don't know what to call it, but a pirate diaspora. At first, they were simply running from the law that very much wanted to see them dead. But then those English privateers no longer had ties to English colonies. They had to make a decision. They could settle down and try to start a life with the threat of execution constantly hanging over their head, or they could become pirates, which is, in many cases, what they did. They cut those ties of loyalty because they were given very few other options by the state. We're witnessing the moment that all of that began to spread, and it spread from disgruntled sailors of a prominently European and Protestant background to sailors and slaves and servants and dispossessed people from all walks of life from all around the world. We're seeing Malay pirates and Spanish people, and we're about to see more and more people of Native American and African and East Indian and Asian descent. We're going to see them join up with the pirates and become part of this movement that had the power to shake the agreed-upon order. We are watching the dawn of this movement through the eyes of the crew of the pirate ship Cygnet. This is episode 136, This Mad Crew. The crew of the pirate ship Cygnet was growing surprisingly quickly. From the crew that left Mindanao back on the 14th of January, somewhere around 90 people, they gained a crew of Malay pirates under Assam. Now those Malay pirates appear to have climbed aboard Cygnet, but their bark may have been along for the ride too. That added maybe 15 pirates that had intimate knowledge of these seas and Spanish shipping. Then on the 4th of March, the pirates captured Aranzazu and took her crew captive, quote-unquote. That was our whole discussion last time, whether or not that Spanish crew willingly joined up. Were they unwilling galley slaves to the pirates, or were they active participants? It's hard to say with so many contradicting sources, but I'm going to err on the side of Aranzazu being willing participants and outright pirates. And that brings the total of the crew up to maybe 120 pirates. They had 2 small frigates and perhaps a bark for a ship's boat. Each of these vessels may have had their original crews on board. Just 3 friendly pirate vessels roaming around in league with one another. Or perhaps the 3 crews integrated. Normally that would be unlikely. However hard I might want to push the power to the people narrative, national and racial boundaries were still very strong. On most buccaneer fleets, you would have French ships with their own leader and English ships with their own leader, and usually whoever had the more was in charge. Here, when we're dealing with a ship of English pirates and a ship of Malay pirates and a ship of Spanish pirates, very likely they would have stayed on their own ships with their own power structures in place. Except in this case. In this case, it would make perfect sense for those crews to integrate. And that's for the purpose of subterfuge. Should they run into the authorities in the region, it would look odd to have an English ship accompanied by a Spanish ship accompanied by a Malay ship. However, if there were a few Malay men on board each of the 3 vessels, then they would look like servants or slaves, which, of course, is part of the agreed-upon order. More practically speaking, if you had a few Malay pirates on board each of the vessels, they could act as navigators. As I said, they knew these waters. And of course, they were in the Philippines, which were named for Philip II, former King of Spain. This was Spanish territory, the westernmost expanse of Nueva España, and they had 25 Spanish sailors who knew maritime trade as it should be practiced in these waters like the back of their hands. Spanish sailors who very likely had Spanish flags and Spanish outfits and, of course, spoke excellent Spanish. Spanish sailors who could, should they run into those authorities, pose as officers. Malay men as their subjugated servants, and then 80 or so English, Irish, and Dutch pirates who knew the art of capturing Spanish booty like no other. It was, if that were in fact how the crews broke down, and I'm not certain that it was, but if it was, that's the perfect cover should they run into the Spanish. It's the perfect disguise should they happen to sail into some Spanish port somewhere with larceny on their mind. Their next destination was Manila. Now, their plan was not to sail into Manila, to bombard the city and sail away with a treasure galleon. I mean, don't get me wrong, that would be great, but also impossible. No, their plan here was twofold. First, to take a survey of potential targets they might capture in the future, and to make contact with an agent they had in the city. I call him an agent, but he wasn't an undercover operative, he wasn't a spy. He was a legal resident of Manila that a few members of the crew happened to know. 3 or 4 years back, the surgeon on board Cygnet, Herman Coppinger, sailed to the Philippines on board a legitimate merchant cruise. On that same voyage, another sailor, an Irish surgeon named Mr. Fitzgerald, met and married a local Philippine mestiza woman. Now, he stayed there in Manila. He opened up a surgery, and he settled down. And we should remember that he was an Irish Catholic, so he was more welcome in Spanish territory than any of the Englishmen would have been. It appears that Herman Coppinger, on that previous voyage, served as surgeon's mate under Mr. Fitzgerald until Mr. Fitzgerald found a wife and settled down, at which point Mr. Coppinger took up the position of surgeon. I picture the pirates' plan, if this were the expository scene in a heist movie, something like this. The Cygnet and the Malay bark were to find a lonesome island somewhere on which to careen their ships. Aranzazu, a known ship with all the proper credentials, would sail boldly into Manila Harbor. There she would dock with her Spanish crew, along with a few Malay men, including Assam, and 2 Englishmen, William Dampier and Herman Coppinger. Those 2 could pose as Irishmen. They were well-dressed, clearly educated, fluent in Spanish, and exactly the sort who might hitch a ride on a Spanish merchant vessel to visit their fellow Irishman and man of science. We can imagine the potential run-ins and close calls. We can imagine our heroes talking their way out of it, or bribing the officials. And we can imagine them finding their contact there in Manila, probably played by Michael Fassbender, and convincing him to come out on one last mission. We could even imagine something like Mr. Fitzgerald's wife having been killed by corrupt Spanish officers, and we can imagine his lust for revenge. We can picture, if we so choose, a sword fight, a dashing duel. We can imagine a carriage chase. We can almost hear the epic soundtrack, and we can see the Tarzan-style series of rope swings from ship to ship, slicing the needed ropes on one ship across the water to the next until they reach their ship Cygnet for a dashing escape. Or we could imagine another scenario. And the problem with all of these contradicting accounts is trying to discern honest motivations. There are those who tell us that Dampier was acting as an insidious pirate captain. Others, Dampier mostly, paint a very different picture. He writes, quote, "Herman Coppinger went ashore, intending to live here, but Captain Reed sent some men to fetch him. I had the same thoughts, for neither he nor I, when we were last on board at Mindanao, had any knowledge of the plot that was laid to leave Captain Swan and run away with the ship. And, being sufficiently weary of this mad crew, we were willing to give them the slip at any place from whence we might hope to get passage to an English factory." End quote. Now, that was written years later. written in a book that was intended to impress a bunch of English scientists, trying very hard to avoid trouble and hopefully to gain a further career in exploration. Should we trust that? Should we trust Ramirez's account from last time? Could we trust the alleged mafioso when they plead their innocence? And as with most things, it's complicated. Personally, I think that both Dampier and Coppinger were fully aware of the piratical intentions of their ship. At the very least, Dampier was. However, I think that they very likely did want to leave the crew at some point. Perhaps that was their plan from the beginning, but they realized they had to leave Mindanao first. I like to imagine Dampier and Coppinger planning some sort of double cross there in Manila. I imagine a plot in which they were to sell out their new pirate friends, and even to cross their English pirate crewmates, in a bid to start a new life in Manila. They've got a crew of Spanish dissidents, those who had abandoned their loyalty, those who had abandoned the agreed-upon order, out there in the harbor right now. There's a bunch of Malay men on that vessel, as well as on the Cygnet, an English ship stolen from the rightful captain in Mindanao. They could name the names of those who were there unwillingly, Josiah Teat and his ilk primarily, and tell the Spanish that they were duped into what they were forced to do. But the rest of those, the pirate contingent among the crew and the Spaniards and the Malay men, would all soon be in shackles. Think about it, though. That would get them in well with the authorities there in Manila. Dampier and Coppinger already had a small nest egg in Spanish gold dust stashed away. Potentially, they could join up with Mr. Fitzgerald's surgery. Dampier was no doctor, but he was a learned man and could surely find something useful and profitable to do with his time, perhaps translating Spanish works. Now, William Dampier was married. So what about Judith, back in merry old England? Well, hiding out in Manila could solve that problem as well. Judith would likely never know what happened to her husband. She would assume that he had died at sea, and any decent middle-class woman, as Judith was, would certainly be able to find a new husband. Meanwhile, Dampier and Coppinger would be able to buy a cute house in their new tropical paradise. Perhaps Dampier could manage their surgery, and Dampier and Coppinger could live together as roommates and very good friends. They would already have been pretending to be Catholic, and any inconsistencies in their behavior would likely be chalked up to being Irish. Yep, just a couple of straight Irish Catholic bachelors living in the Philippines. I like to imagine that as kind of a happy ending for those two. It certainly would have been happier for them, and it would have been much happier for those who would go on to suffer at the hands of William Dampier. And we can imagine that happy ending all we like, but it would not come to pass. We can imagine that dashing roguish tale from earlier all we like, but that would not come to pass. The Manila mission never took place. On their way to Manila, the pirates met a storm which blew their little fleet off to the west, into the Philippine Sea. Now, this was to be expected. All of the wind was blowing in a westerly direction, but there was no good way to turn around at the moment. Remember, that's the entire reason that the crew, led by John Reed in particular, was so keen to leave Mindanao in the first place, these westerly winds. The Cygnet and her 2 accompanying vessels left the Philippines and headed for mainland Asia. So here we need to talk a bit about mainland Southeast Asia. That mainland Southeast Asia is the preferred nomenclature for the region, but you might also know it as Indochina. And that term has connotations of imperialism. European imperialism, yes, but also Indian and Chinese imperialism. Generally these days it's frowned upon, but as a descriptor of the region it's not tremendously inaccurate. Mainland Southeast Asia has for centuries been a cultural crossroads for those 2 powers. Now I assure you I'm going to keep this brief, but we do need to go back to the dawn of civilization. When we talk about the rise of civilization, which is to say agriculture and writing and religions, organized religions, and laws, usually people talk about 3 distinct regional civilizational revolutions. First, we have the cradle of civilization in what we would consider the Middle East today. Then we see the rise of the Indus Valley civilization in modern India, followed very shortly by the rise in Chinese civilization at the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. Now, that's not to say that there were not human beings living vibrant and meaningful lives elsewhere, but basically they didn't have writing yet. And later there would be subsequent revolutions in sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas and Europe, and even here in Indochina, but in many cases, the Americas excluded, they were influenced by one of those big three. Indochina, or mainland Southeast Asia, was right in the middle of the Indus Valley and Chinese civilization. The whole region was, and is today still, a lush and fertile region. Now, the indigenous people living there, and there were a ton of them, they had a wide variety of languages and religions and lifestyles, but they didn't have organized religion, or written law, or the written word. That, and thus the rise of what we consider civilization, came from invaders. As India and China grew, they took notice of the region as a lush and fertile place. They began moving in, only on the fringes at first, to the northwest and the northeast. Then Alexander the Great and the cradle of civilization came crashing into India. Almost immediately following that, Chandragupta gave rise to an Indian empire that stretched into modern-day Myanmar. Now, Myanmar, also known as Burma, was the doorway into which all of Indian civilization reached mainland Southeast Asia. Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam all came marching through that Myanmar doorway. Now, over to the northeast side of mainland Southeast Asia, there was a Proto-Vietnamese civilization, situated almost right up to China. That civilization remained mostly independent. Over a couple of thousand years, they would trade territories with the Chinese, but doing so also traded culture and influence. This Proto-Vietnamese people gained the Chinese style of pottery and Chinese styles of rice cultivation and the written word, though they also influenced China in their own style of the written word, but most prominently in Buddhism. So you have these two kingdoms, Myanmar and Vietnam, that are the largest political powers in mainland Southeast Asia, influenced primarily by India on one side and China on the other. But then you have this host of smaller city-states dotting the region. There are those who would argue that the rise of Greece as a single political and cultural entity came together because of outside pressures, Persia mainly, but also the strong arm of Alexander. What we would consider Thailand, and thus the lands of modern-day Laos and Cambodia and southern Vietnam, well, that was forged in a similar fire. Instead of Persia and the Roman Empire, it was India and the Chinese. And many of those city-states in Southeast Asia were comparable to the likes of Athens or Sparta. They had relatively powerful militaries. They had their own philosophical thought. They had writing and agriculture and laws and religion. They had everything that one needed to be a civilization, but they didn't have that second step to what people considered civilization at the time, an empire. But then, around the early to high Middle Ages, right around the 10th century, we see a rise of a people called the Thai. Now, the Thai were distinct, culturally and linguistically, from the people of the rest of mainland Southeast Asia. However, they began to spread into the rest of the region. They started taking over city-states. However, the Thai weren't necessarily unified. By the height of their rise to power, they had split primarily into two separate states, the Kingdom of Angkor and the Kingdom of Ayodhya. Respectively, Angkor was the forebear of what we would consider Cambodia, and Ayodhya the forebear of Siam, of course, later known as Thailand. Now, the rise of the Thai chased out most of the indigenous Malay people into the most southern reaches, the Malay Peninsula, and into modern Indonesia. So there we have 5 major powers in place: Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia. What we would consider Laos was still mostly unaffiliated, but was usually influenced mostly by one or another of these powers. But then, as the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, Europe once again came crashing into Asia. This time they did so on ships rather than chariots, and it was far more damaging to the region. It was those Europeans that gave the name Indochina to mainland Southeast Asia, but that's actually still anachronistic to our story. The term Indochina did not come around until much later, the 19th century. Dampier never uses it in his work. Instead, he mostly uses names that we would recognize today. Which only makes sense. These were English colonial names for countries and kingdoms that had their own names. Dampier tells us that he and the Cygnet were headed for Cambodia. And that was accurate at the time, but the island on which they landed was called Pulo Condor. Now that was a Cambodian name, but today it's known as Con San, off the southeast coast of Vietnam. As an aside, and this is something we'll likely have to talk about more in the future, but at this very moment, King Louis XIV of France was hosting an entourage of Siamese diplomats. An entourage that would lead to an alliance and a French interest in Indochina. In fact, due in very large part to Dampier's findings here, this island of Pulo Condor, or Con San, would host an English East India Company in just a few years. However, that outpost only lasted for 3 years. That was due to a joint French and Siamese intervention. The Siamese and their French allies were attempting to ensure that no European powers would gain a colonial foothold in the region. Of course, that French intervention is why that Cambodian island is today Vietnamese. However, that's all in the future. Some of it in the near future, much of it in the very, very great future. For now, though, you all should know everything there is to know about Southeast Asia, with no generalizations or blind spots or inaccuracies, and we can move on. Cygnet's stopover at Pulo Condor was something of a turning point for the crew of the Cygnet. They spent a number of weeks there, and Dampier tells us all about the place. He spends a lot of time describing the natural harbors and the geography. He talks about verdant fields and rice paddies and rocky hillsides. He describes the wild mango and, East India men take note, the uncultivated nutmeg. You can see why the English might put a factory there. Dampier describes the language and the politics and the trade, and he describes the prostitutes. In short, William Dampier describes the civilization of the place. The pirates, though, really liked the prostitutes of Pulo Condor. They all seem to have enjoyed their time to the fullest there. But I should say that these women were not sex workers in any traditional sense of the word. Rather, they seemed more like hostages almost, maybe better described as bribes that were sent to the pirates to ensure their good behavior while there at the island. Dampier writes, quote, "They are so free of their women that they would bring them aboard and offer them to us. Many of our men hired them for a small matter. Most of our men had women aboard all the time of our abode there. In Africa, also, seamen that reside there have their Delilahs. It is accounted a piece of policy to do it, for the captains have great men's daughters offered them, or even the king's wives. By this sort of alliance, the country people are engaged to a greater friendship." End quote. I ended that quote just a bit early. I wanted to continue on with it, but it's filled with a bunch of language and racist imperialism that I'm not tremendously comfortable with. However, I will tell you the gist of what Dampier says. He tells us that those Delilahs worked to keep the peace in the following fashion. Whenever the locals were planning some sort of violence against the pirates, in reality it was probably revenge, but Dampier paints it as barbarous treachery to which these people are accustomed. But whenever violence was imminent, these Delilahs, who, as Dampier explains, obviously knew the superiority of white men, Whenever that violence was imminent, the women would tell the Englishmen, or the French or Dutchmen, about it. And perhaps that did happen on occasion, likely because the women on board knew that the pirates had the military capability to kill all of their husbands and brothers and fathers. What Dampier doesn't mention, and I presume probably never took into account, is that while these women were one part distraction and one part bribe, they were also one part spy. If the pirates were there planning any sort of violence, these women knew about it and would be able to warn their people. And one cannot argue the effectiveness of that strategy. Now, I would note that when Dampier talks about Africa, he's talking about the pirate colony at Madagascar. That's a place that Dampier has yet to see, but he's going to before returning home and writing his book. Of course, William Dampier did not partake in the enjoyment of these Dalilahs. He was a happily married man, after all. Instead, Dampier was engrossed by the temples and the carvings of elephants and horses and Buddhas he found there. And, he should be. That part of the world is home to some of the most impressive religious architecture in all of world history. So we have this picture painted by Dampier of a science-minded man who's exploring temples and fields, all in the interest of gathering information for England. All the while, the pirates, of whom Dampier was an unwilling companion, debauched themselves with women and wine which they paid for through plunder. It's a striking image, if probably deeply inaccurate. What Dampier neglects to mention, though, is how those pirates came by that plunder. You may remember, back in Mindanao, that most of these men chose to turn pirate because they didn't have any money stashed away. That's the strongest argument that Dampier makes toward he and Mr. Coppinger being unwilling participants. They did have a little bit of money. But here we see the pirates flush, gambling and drinking and renting the services of local women. One might assume, piracy, but the Cygnet was currently ashore. Most of the crew of Cygnet, when they weren't otherwise engaged, were busy careening her. They were cleaning and repairing and refitting the ship, and this was a big undertaking here. They made Cygnet a pirate frigate that Blackbeard himself would have recognized. This took time. But that leaves the Aranzazu as their primary vessel, and Aranzazu was captained by none other than William Dampier. Naturalist, writer, gentle soul William Dampier, currently commanding pirate raids against a host of peaceful vessels all across the South China Sea. And that is according to nearly everyone that was there except for Dampier, including Ramirez and Assam. Now, most of what they took were local ships, regional ships at least, Vietnamese or Cambodian, Siamese, a couple of Philippine ships, and even a Chinese junk. Now, the junk was their biggest haul, but none of their prizes were fabulously rich. However, they were satisfying. Anyone who sailed with Dampier brought back a little something valuable. Maybe a few pieces of silver or some silk or spices or dyes, but more than that, those crews brought back wonderful culinary treats. I mean, imagine that you've been scrubbing at a hull all day in the very hot tropical sun. You're looking forward to retiring with your Delilah for the evening, but then, on the horizon, Dampier shows up, and he's got rice wine and mangoes and a succulent pig and exotic spices. Perhaps he even kidnapped a cook to cook it for you. Likely they didn't need to, the locals had cooks of their own. But suddenly, this evening turns into a party. There's music and there's dancing girls. And who is to thank for all of that? Was it Captain Reed, the man who had you working in the hot sun all day? No, it was William Dampier. And the crew was very aware of that. Anyone who made any money in this time sailed with Dampier. Anybody who had a good time in this time did so thanks to Dampier. Captain Reed probably condoned, perhaps even ordered Dampier to do this to keep the crew happy. But around this time, things took a turn for the worse. And the problem lay almost entirely in the figure of Captain John Reed. Reed was not a good captain. He was kind of dumb. He was very egotistical, and he appears to have been racked with insecurities. But he played to the baser instincts of his crew. He manipulated their own insecurities, and he exploited their fears. And sadly, that group, the group that was loyal to John Reed, held the majority. What I consider the sensible members of the crew didn't have the power to vote John Reed out as captain. Dampier and Coppinger and Josiah Teat, maybe a dozen others. They didn't have any power among the crew, but they were unhappy with this state of affairs. And you might remember back to when a number of these pirates, including Dampier, took part in the first Pacific adventure. They ran into this very same problem. Captain Sharp was a terrible captain. He led them to disaster after disaster because of his own egoism. And a minority of the crew dissented to his having power. However, that minority, in that case, had another ship, a ship that they could and did take to leave him behind. Now, here in the East Indies, they had that same thing. They had Cygnet and they had the Malay bark, but they also had the Aranzazu, a seaworthy vessel that could get the dissenters home, or at the very least to a safe English harbor. Of course, Aranzazu did not technically belong to Dampier or his faction, but when did that ever stop the pirates? If they did have a plan to leave the crew of Cygnet behind, they had the ability to do so. But at the moment, they were in the extreme minority. Most of the crew was eager for action and plunder, because they wanted the money, sure, but also the excitement of it. I mean, at this point, Cygnet was one of the best pirate ships in the world. Not only that, they had a bark and another frigate. They had the makings of a fleet that would be a terror on the high seas, which is something every pirate or potential pirate wants to be a part of. And John Reed was their admiral. However, John Reed made some bad decisions here. Dampier tells us that they left the ship they took at Manila, the Aranzazu, there at Pulo, Condor. They just left it there. Maybe they gave it as a gift to their hosts for all of the generosity, and on the one hand, that does kind of make sense. Now that the plan to infiltrate Manila had been botched, and the Cygnet was up and running, they did not really need the Aranzazu. They could use just the Cygnet and their bark. That was sufficient, but I think that Reed's reasoning was a lot more selfish and grim than all of that. I think that Captain John Reed, full of faults as he was, probably wanted to secure his command. And that's why he made the decision to leave Aranzazu behind. He cut off their escape route and made sure that there was no captain other than him on the voyage. I mean, think about the success that Dampier enjoyed while Reed was busy careening. He had more prizes and more victories under his belt in a mere few weeks than John Reed had had in his several months as captain. To an insecure person, Dampier would look very much like a threat. And if Dampier had his own ship and his own command, the crew might see him as a valid replacement for captain. And I think that informed not only the leaving of Aranzazu behind, but I think it informed Captain Reed's next big decision. Cygnet had a Cambodian guide on board who was leading them toward the Gulf of Siam. And they ran into a few ships out there, but according to Dampier, they didn't attack any of them. They got directions or traded, and they sailed on in peace. This kind of makes sense, but it also looks a bit weak on the part of the captain. But then, Captain Reed spotted a Malay ship in the distance, and he ordered the pilot of Cygnet to set a heading to capture that next big prize. But Assam, the Malay pirate, objected. This pirate who operated in the region, who knew his business and who knew the people, told Captain Reed to leave that ship alone and to sail on. Attacking her was a bad idea. But there's a problem. Assam probably did not speak much English, and Captain Reed didn't speak much Spanish. That means that Assam would have had to talk to Dampier to voice his objection, and that means that Dampier would have spoken to Captain Reed. Think about what that looks like. It looks like Reed made a bold and potentially profitable decision to attack that ship. Dampier, his chief rival, told Reed to leave it alone. If you are a captain insecure in your command, a captain who maybe thought that Dampier was trying to steal the command by stealing all the glory, if you were a captain who was too stupid to listen to the local pirate, well, that was just unacceptable. Captain Reed ignored the advice and set a heading for the Malay vessel. Dampier tells us, quote, Captain Reed sent a canoe aboard her. It was a Malayan vessel, the men desperate fellows whose vessels are commonly full of those who all wear cressets or little daggers. The crew went aboard, all but one man that stayed in the canoe. The Malayans, who were about 20 of them, seeing our men all armed, at once drew out their cressets and stabbed 5 or 6 of our men. The rest leapt overboard and so got away. Daniel Wallace leapt into the sea, who could never swim before nor since, yet now he swam very well before he was taken up. End quote. So Captain Reed sent a canoe over to judge the situation. He sent men aboard who were immediately, some of them, stabbed to death, and the rest forced to flee. Now think about how that looks. Dampier, popular and successful Captain Dampier, warned you not to attack that ship, and he turned out to be right. Now 6 of your men are dead, and it's all your fault. Of course, Reed attempted to pursue the Malayans and get his vengeance, but they escaped. They got ashore and into the jungle, so Captain Reed failed once again. This is the event that really opened up a rift in the crew. All of those men who had been eager for plunder and glory began to see that perhaps Captain Reed was not the man to give it to them. To make matters even worse, among the sensible faction, they had news very recently. One of those ships that they had stopped to trade with a few days prior told the crew of an English factory on Sumatra. Now that was an outpost that the English had no knowledge of until that very moment, and it was relatively close. They could get there. That was, for the crew who did not want to be there any longer, a way out, a way home, a way to escape this life with this mad crew before they were caught or killed, before they were lost at sea in one or another of the terrible storms, before any of 1,000 terrible fates befell them. That was a way to escape. For those who were indisposed to being outright pirates, or at least didn't trust Captain Reed, that was salvation. The quote I read earlier, being sufficiently weary of this mad crew, we were willing to give them the slip at any place. It was about this moment here. That's when it becomes relevant. This is where that incident took place when Coppinger tried to escape and was brought back by force. He was trying to escape, and Dampier wanted to go with him to escape to Sumatra, which would get him home to England. And they weren't alone in that. After this little incident with the Malay vessel, a lot of the crew wanted out. But Captain Reed had other plans. He recaptured Coppinger, he reasserted his authority over the crew, and then he set a course in exactly the opposite direction, away from the Gulf of Siam and away from Sumatra. He set a course back to Manila. I have a piece of advice for all of you. It's advice that I only follow sporadically at best, but it's good advice nonetheless. We should all keep a journal or a diary. We should take the time to find a few minutes every day to sit down and handwrite your experiences. Keeping a journal is kind of meditative. It makes you pause and reflect. And it also forces you to examine how you spend your time. When you have to physically write down that you sat on the couch and played video games for 8 hours, you might change up your routine. Not that I've ever done that. And who knows, one day, far in the future, someone might just find something in your journals valuable enough to do a podcast about them. I am eternally grateful to all of those pirates who wrote down their experiences. William Dampier and Basil Ringrose, Alexander Exquemelin. Simultaneously, though, I'm frustrated at the scarce nature of those primary sources when talking about pirates. It could be worse. I mean, we could be dealing with medieval history, and thank God we aren't, but pirates are generally not well known to be literate and forward-thinking. And wouldn't you just love to have the personal stories from a bunch of different pirate ships? Ships that we know nothing about aside from maybe their one big haul. An account from any of 100 different ships that were sailing during the Golden Age of which we know virtually nothing. And even the bigger ships, wouldn't you want Henry Avery's diary or Calico Jack's diary? Or even the diary of his quartermaster or just a deckhand on board? That would be fantastic. It would really flesh out the world of the pirates. However, we should be thankful for what we do have. Dampier's account is wonderful. It's one of the best we have in regard to pirates. And that's unfortunate today because it's about to come to an end. Dampier has and will go on to wear many hats, but no longer, after today, will he wear the tricorn of a pirate. And of course I am obligated to point out that tricorns, while popular in high society to show off the wigs, weren't proper pirate gear, but that's neither here nor there. Dampier's adventures will continue on, and we will cover them when that time comes. But today, we're going to see the end of Dampier's career as a pirate. This is episode 137, Escape from Cygnet. And as Dampier's career as a pirate comes to an end, we're going to leave his story behind. Not for good, of course, but for a while. However, I really don't want to be done with Dampier's tale. I love his story. It's got elements that I just love. It's got adventure, excitement, globe-trotting exploration, and it's got the first English accounts of a number of customs and traditions that range all the way from Malaysia to Australia. For example, Dampier may have been the first English person to note the use of chopsticks. Now, you and I know what chopsticks are, but William Dampier did not. And I want to talk about that. I find it fascinating. It's an interesting corner in world history. However, were I to explore that, it would lead me into the weeds. I would wind up talking about the history of chopsticks, which naturally would lead into a history of Chinese cuisine. Incidentally, chopsticks were originally a cooking tool, much like tongs used for grilling. However, as Chinese culinary customs shifted away from grilling and toward stewed dishes and wok cooking, chopsticks left behind their use as a tool and took up their modern role as cutlery. And then, of course, we would have to take into account Confucianism and imperial dictates, and that would, of course, lead into a bit about the Great British Baking Show, which I love, and a Dutch dish they made on there that used 2 sticks to make these tiny little round pancakes stuffed with apple. And that, delicious as it is, would naturally take us into imperialism in China, which would lead to me taking cheap shots at Xi Jinping, which I don't want to do. Now, did I have this episode completed? Yes, I did. Was it, upon reflection, a series of incoherent ramblings that had absolutely nothing to do with pirates? Oh, you bet it was. So instead of that, I'm going to let William Dampier himself tell us why I should not go down that road, why I shouldn't explore all of those winding paths. He spends pages talking about China, and then writes, prior to more pages about China, quote, "A particular account of them and their country would fill a volume. Nor doth my short experience qualify me to say much," end quote, although he said plenty. So we're going to stick with Dampier's story when it intersects with pirates, or when it's relevant to pirates. And don't worry, that happens kind of a lot from here on out. Now, last time I left off with a bit of a cliffhanger. I told you that the Cygnet and her pirate crew was headed for Manila, headed back to Manila after having been frustrated in their first attempt. They really wanted a shot at that Acapulco ship, that Manila galleon. They were unable to reach their destination because, and this is some pretty technical sailing jargon, so try to keep up here, the wind was blowing the other way. If, last time when I left off on that cliffhanger, you thought to yourself something along the lines of, but wait, didn't they fail to reach Manila last time because of the, wind? If you thought anything like that, then you're quicker than 90% of the Cygnet's crew. I mean, William Dampier knew that it wouldn't work. Herman Coppinger knew it wouldn't work. Assam and Alonzo Ramirez knew it. The Spanish, the Dutch, the Philippine, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Indonesians, everybody knew that that would not work. But John Reed and his lot, they thought to themselves, maybe. And if this were a question of a bold assault, or a scientific innovation, or maybe a political idea that everyone already knew was just impossible, then I would applaud them. I would applaud their stubbornness. But it's not a scientific innovation or a bold assault. Maybe an attempt at a bold assault, but it's just the wind was blowing the other way. These sailors should have known they could not reach Manila. However, they tried and failed. Instead, they were blown to China. Now there in China, they roamed the coast for several months, hopping north and south to different islands and port cities. But this is the bit that I'm skipping over. Dampier goes into great detail in describing China. And considering the succeeding relations between China and England, there might be something there that we could make of this. But really, it's not that consequential. Dampier wrote, I think, so much about China due to the Chinese fever that was gripping most of Europe, and England especially, in the late 17th century. A full 2 years before William Dampier arrived in China, a year before he arrived in Asia, a Catholic Chinese missionary named Michael Shin-Fu Sung was making a procession throughout Europe. Michael was a native Chinese speaker, but he also spoke Latin, being a Catholic priest. That allowed him to speak to the popes and potentates that he met along the way. It allowed him to teach at monasteries in Italy and France and in England. He personally showed Louis XIV how to use chopsticks well before Dampier saw them, and Michael Shin-Fu Sung met King James II of England. There's a portrait of him hanging in the English gallery today. You're seeing a lot of this around this time. There is a heavy European presence in Asia, and that's why there were Siamese and Chinese diplomats and missionaries sent to go explore and learn about Europe. And then here is William Dampier. A buccaneer, yes, but also an explorer and a naturalist. He was tramping around Asia at just the moment that Michael Shin-Fu Sung was in England. He returned to England sometime after the missionary left English shores, but he had this intimate knowledge about China, and his publishers wanted very much for him to write about it. And not just China. He went to a lot of places that were important to the English. Looking with hindsight, his book reads just a little bit, in fact quite a lot bit, like a travel guide for the forthcoming British Empire. As we will see. Upon leaving China, with an eye to cruising for plunder, the ship headed south. They didn't find much plunder, though. They took an odd, uncharted route through the East Indies. Dampier writes, quote, "This seemed to be a very tedious way about, and dangerous for shoals, but not for meeting with English or Dutch ships, which was their greatest fear." End quote. They were on the hunt for plunder, and they found virtually none. But even more than that, the most important thing, what was paramount to Captain Reed and Josiah Teat, and really all of the pirates, was to avoid any European presence there. That would lead to, at best, uncomfortable questions, and at worst, mass execution. However, they successfully navigated the East Indies without running into any authorities. They made landfall at a small island that had a few friendly locals there. The pirates traded with the locals and had a feast, but then the Cygnet decided to use that island as kind of a base. Most of the crew headed out to cruise for booty, but a few elected to stay on the island. Dampier did not stay on the island. It looks like he was not allowed to. He was needed for navigation. But maybe a dozen did. And I think that they chose to stay there hoping that a ship, English or Dutch or whoever the Cygnet was trying to avoid, might pass by and might pick them up. All of the men who stayed behind were of a mind with Dampier. They were part of that group that did not want to partake in piracy any longer, or at the very least didn't want to serve under Captain John Reed. Now, no ships would stop by, but regardless, those crewmen who stayed behind found themselves in a bit of a tight spot. We need to mention a custom among the people on that island, a custom that's common around the world. The children there did not cut their hair. They wore it loose and long. Women, upon reaching maturity, began wearing their hair up in a bun. Men, upon maturity, cut their hair short. But in the England of the 17th century, men typically grew their hair out long, or they kept their hair very, very short and wore wigs. However, at this time wigs were out of fashion because Louis XIV did not wear a wig. He had beautiful auburn curls, but wigs would come back into fashion in a few short years once Louis began losing his hair. However, the pirates didn't have wigs. They had natural long hair. The women of that island convinced the pirates who had been left behind to cut their hair short. That's a bit odd, but it is the custom, and they were men there. Perhaps they offended by having long hair. But then those men were presented with tools and a parcel of land that they were told belonged to them. That might put you on your guard, but not so much as what happened next. All of the girls who were almost ready to tie up their hair were brought out before the pirates and offered to them for marriage. One of the pirates, a particularly handsome young man who was quite proud of his golden locks, refused to cut his hair, and woke up one morning with a young woman standing above him with a knife. Not to, kill him or anything. She wanted to cut his hair so he could marry her. The crewmen managed to get away without marriage, only by the skin of their teeth, though. Lucky for them, the Cygnet returned just a few days later in late September 1687, which, if you're keeping track, is a long time after the last time we checked the date. Dampier was in China for quite some time. But the whole crew was ready to set sail by the 13th of October. However, they had yet to decide where to sail exactly. As they were a buccaneer crew, they decided to vote on their decision. Dampier writes, quote, "Every man wished himself at home, as they had done 100 times before, but Captain Reed and Josiah Teat persuaded them to cruise the Red Sea. They easily prevailed with the crew. I was well enough satisfied, knowing that the farther we went, the more knowledge and experience I should get, which was the main thing I regarded, and should also have the more variety of places to attempt an escape, being resolved to take the first opportunity of giving them the slip." End quote. Their plan was to head back north and west, through the Spice Islands and around Indonesia into the Indian Ocean. From there, they could travel across the ocean to Africa, up the coast, and into the Red Sea. Along the way, they saw a number of amazing things unlike anything they had ever seen before. They saw trees that were larger than any back in Europe. They saw water spouts and tornadoes jump up before them. They even found an island that operated kind of like the Vikings had. Their primary export was slaves. They raided their neighbors and then sold the captives to other neighbors or to passing European pirates. Captain Reed was in need of a cabin boy, and he found one there, what Dampier describes as a, quote, "pretty young boy," end quote. But he had an interesting trait. This boy had 4 rows of teeth. He had 2 on top and 2 on bottom. Another thing that none of them had ever seen before, and Dampier said never saw nor heard tell of ever again. And that's cool and all, but really that's about the most interesting thing they saw. More or less, it was an uneventful trip, until, that is, they made their way back to the Philippines. They decided to stop just off an island that they knew they had been there before, right off the coast of Mindanao. They were cleaning Cygnet's hull when a familiar craft approached them. That ship was the leisure craft of the Sultan of Mindanao himself. However, the Sultan wasn't on board. Instead, they saw the Sultan's son. And actually, they'd met the Sultan's son on board this ship some time before. He was one of the two men that greeted them when they first arrived in Mindanao. The boy's father, the Sultan of Mindanao, was dead. Rumor had it Raja Laut, the Sultan's brother, was behind it. Raja Laut had taken power upon the death of the Sultan and attempted, in a bid to secure his throne, to kill the young prince. Now that resulted in a civil war. The prince was allied with some of the Malay pirates and a rival sultanate to Mindanao, and actually some of the people within Mindanao that lived in the hills. That would all lead to the Spanish taking advantage of the situation and taking more and more control on the island, but that's later on. But who do you imagine was there, seen at Mindanao, fighting alongside Raja Laut? None other than our old friend Charles Swan. According to the prince, Raja Laut had commandeered that chest full of gold. He had it in his possession and was using that gold to buy men and munitions for the war. Having no ship and no money to purchase a ship, Charles Swan and the other Englishmen were hostages. However, Raja Laut assured Charles Swan that if they fought alongside him, and if they were victorious, the people of Mindanao would furnish their finest and largest ship with all of the amenities on board. They would fill the holds with all of the finest treasures of the East Indies, and they would send him back to England in style, triumphant. Now that sounds great, but of course Charles Swan did not really have a choice. The prince, though, the prince in exile, was of the opinion that if the pirates of the Cygnet joined the fight on his side, they might turn the tide. They might rescue Swan and all of their former English comrades. That might peel away more followers from Raja Laut, and they just might have a fighting chance. And should they prevail, the prince said, he would offer them their whole chest of gold in return, as well as that ship. And some members of the crew wanted to do just that. They debated the topic, but John Reed had that talent for playing on his men's insecurity. John Reed reminded the crew of all of the injustices that had been handed down by Swan. He pointed at every man that had been personally shamed by their former captain. He pointed at them until they lowered their eyes. As for the rest, those who maybe didn't have as personal a grudge against Swan, he knew how to play to their fears. He convinced them that Mindanao was a quagmire that would swallow them whole. In the end, they voted not to aid their former captain and to leave as fast as possible to avoid wars between foreign princes. Dampier does mention a tale, something he heard many months later, something he heard from a crew that personally knew Captain Swan. That crew had news of Captain Swan's death and the death of the other Englishmen. Now their reports differed. Some said he was poisoned, others said they fell in battle, but all of their former associates were dead there at Mindanao. However, Dampier did not know that yet. For the time being, they ran. They sailed south and east until they arrived at the farthest reaches of maritime Southeast Asia. There, the Cygnet came upon an island, a large island that nobody recognized. They found no cities or no ports, and they found no people at all, at least at first. Dampier takes a stab in the dark here. He hypothesizes that they may have been at an island that belonged to William, the Prince of Orange. That island was known as New Holland, but that was no good name for an Englishman. Dampier assumed, though did not know, that these were the islands known throughout Europe as Terra Australis Incognito. In Latin, the unknown southern land. Now that idea was ancient. It dated all the way back to Alexander the Great and came to them through ancient Rome. But it wasn't until Dutch adventurers stumbled upon the place about a century earlier that Europeans had any idea what was there. And still they had very little idea outside of the Netherlands. I struggled with how much time I wanted to spend on Australia. I could skip over it, just as I had China. However, interesting things happened here. And more to the point, Dampier, later on, is going to have a very complicated relationship with the island. This was a brief stopover, but his first sight of Australia. Dampier, though, did not like the place. He notes the lack of anchorage there. He sees the tall cliffs, and he likens those to Peru or even England. And then Dampier writes, quote, "The land is of a dry, sandy soil, destitute of water, yet producing trees. But the woods are not thick, nor the trees very big. The trees were not known by any of us. We saw none that bore fruit or berries. We saw no sort of animal, nor any track but once. Nor is the sea plentifully stored with fish." End quote. It's a destitute place, dry and without much life, nothing to sustain people. But then, Dampier and the rest of the crew met the people of Australia, the indigenous aboriginal people. But Dampier did not like them either. Famously, he did not like them. He wrote, quote, "The inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the world. They have no houses, garments, or fruits of the earth. Setting aside their human shape, they differ but little from brutes. Their eyelids are always half closed to keep the flies out of their eyes. Without the assistance of both hands to keep them off, they will creep into one's nostrils and mouth. Being annoyed with these insects, they never open their eyes as do other people." End quote. I'm cutting out some of the less savory bits there, but I think that gives the tenor of his narrative. And I'm skipping over entirely his anatomical description of the people of Australia. However, after that, Dampier continues, quote, "They have no clothes but a piece of rind of a tree, tied like a girdle about their waists to cover their nakedness. They have no houses built, but lie in the open air without any covering, the earth being their bed, and heaven their canopy. Their only food is a small sort of fish. There is neither herb, nor root, nor grain to eat, nor bird or beast to hunt, having no instruments to do so." End quote. They were a miserable people, in Dampier's estimation, in part because of the miserable land in which they lived, but also in part due to what he saw as their inferiority. And we might chalk that up to typical European imperialism, and Dampier was certainly often guilty of that. However, in almost all the other cases, Dampier finds something complimentary to say, something interesting to talk about. You know, they had cool ships or good food. Maybe they had amazing booze. Perhaps they had pretty clothes or pretty women or exotic dances. Maybe they had great pottery or ingenious crafting skills or metalwork or something. Even when Dampier was looking down on Native American people, he had all of those noble savage tropes to throw around. He found something positive to talk about, but he saw nothing at all noble in the people of Australia. Dampier falls into another prejudice common among Europeans imbued with the Protestant work ethic. He calls them lazy. And the attitude is, well, I mean, who do these people think they are? Fishing only until they have enough to eat, then returning home to all of the beautiful nude women to eat and dance and enjoy their lives? What are they doing? I mean, there's profit to be made. And Dampier really leans into that. And I don't know if that's genuine prejudice on his part, or if it's a bit of propaganda. There was certainly prejudice there, but I tend to think that there was propaganda there as well, written after the fact. I think that because of future events, though. Events that we're not going to delve into today, but if the people of Australia were little better than animals, then what harm would a few horrific atrocities against them do? And take into account what Dampier has to say about the defensive capabilities of the people of Australia. He writes, quote, "These poor creatures have a sort of weapon to fight with their enemies. Some had wooden swords, others a sort of lance. The sword is a piece of wood, shaped somewhat like a cutlass. The lance is a long straight pole hardened by heat. I saw no iron nor any other sort of metal. It is probable they use stone hatchets." End quote. These people were, in terms of technological development, far behind most of the rest of the world. And Dampier, later on, was going to make use of that knowledge. However, for the time being, the Cygnet had visited China and Taiwan and now Australia. And later on in his story, Dampier's going to be visiting India and an English colony on the coast of Africa. As I said, his book is a travel guide for the British Empire. But you need to keep in mind that all of this is taking months and months. We're through all of 1687 and well into 1688 by this point. By the time they left Australia, it was February 1688. However, they realized that their initial plan was not going to work, so they headed up north. They headed up north and west, past all of those European ports and shipping lanes, and made their way between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, out of Indonesia and maritime Southeast Asia, and into the open Indian Ocean. Now, the reason that I was able to skip over all that time is because so little of consequence happened. Sure, some interesting exploration stuff, but, nothing exciting. But the reason that nothing exciting occurred is due almost entirely to Captain Reed's reluctance to do anything that might alert the authorities. Remember, that was paramount. The Dutch and English powers in the region could not have any indication, could have no sign that there were pirates afoot. He took great pains to ensure their anonymity. But then, of course, there was the English presence there on Sumatra that the crew had known about for about a year. And they were perilously close to Sumatra, but Reed decided to take action. He knew that some of his crew were very likely planning to steal a boat and make it to one of the nearby islands or a shoreline that was inhabited. From there, they could book passage with the local people to that English colony. To ensure that that was impossible, that the people of these islands would not trust any members of the crew, Captain Reed captured a small local proa. Dampier writes, quote, "It was not for the lucre of the cargo that Captain Reed took this boat, but to hinder me and some others from going ashore. For he knew that we were ready to make our escape if an opportunity presented itself. And he thought that by abusing and robbing the natives, we should be afraid to trust ourselves among them. But this proceeding of his turned to our advantage." End quote. Captain Reed's plan did work. It did frighten the people of those islands, and it warned them not to trust the pirates there. However, the people of these islands were old hands when it came to dealing with pirates, or really raiders of any kind. They had a system in place. Whenever word of pirates, be they Malay pirates or otherwise, or really whenever word of any hostile ship, many of whom may have been Europeans that were legal representatives of the king, but, who came to kill the islanders, whenever they received word of anything like that, they lit signal fires. These were huge bonfires built atop massive piers that could be seen for great distances. A few of the larger islands even had mirrors that had been given to them from the Dutch colonists on the mainland. They were made to amplify the light of their signal fires. When one fire was lit, anybody that saw it followed suit. Suddenly, there were dozens of huge fires dotting the horizon. It was impossible to miss. Now, Do you remember, a few minutes ago, when I said that the Cygnet and Captain John Reed were trying very, very hard to avoid notice? That it was paramount that they avoid any hint of their presence in the region, to lay low, to go under the radar. Well, all of those bonfires counted as the opposite of laying low. Any passing Dutch ship in the region would certainly notice those gargantuan bonfires and rush to the nearest Dutch port to tell them that the beacons are lit, the islanders call for aid. At which point, I assume, the governor there would take a pregnant pause before replying, "And the Netherlands will answer." Long story short, this was bad news for Captain Reed. This was flashing lights in the rear-view mirror. This was 5 stars and Grand Theft Auto. The cops were on their way, and they had a lot of cannons. So Captain Reed ordered the Cygnet to run. Again. They ran into the Indian Ocean as fast as possible, and they escaped the authorities there. Happily, they found a piece of land on which they could rest. The Nicobar Islands, out in the Bay of Bengal, are a small island group that have, on occasion, offered sanctuary to ships that have lost their way or been blown off course. They still serve that purpose often today. Honestly, they look like some of the most beautiful places in the world. Cygnet anchored there, and then Dampier writes, quote, "I desired Captain Reed to set me ashore. He, supposing that I could not go ashore in a place less frequented by ships than this, gave me leave, which probably he would have refused to have done if he thought I should have gotten from hence in any short time, for fear of my giving an account of him to the English or Dutch." End quote. Dampier was sent ashore because he spoke Malay and Spanish. He spoke both pretty well, actually, and that gave him the best chance of being able to speak with whoever lived on that island. As he approached the shore in a boat, he was met by a proa full of men that were armed with spears. However, those men saw that only Dampier and one other man to row the boat were there, so they escorted Dampier ashore to meet with their elder. Now, as it happens, the people of Great Nicobar did not speak Malay. However, the elder did have a bit of it from his time trading, so they were able to communicate in a broken, difficult language. However, Dampier did well here. He made a show of deference to the elder and was warmly received by all of the people. The elder of Great Nicobar invited Dampier to stay there on the island with him in his home, but he told him no other pirates. They could have no more than 3 men, including Dampier, on shore at a time. If they broke that rule, they could expect to be attacked by the many, many warriors there who outnumbered whoever was on that ship. Whether or not that's true, I like this move by this elder a lot. Dampier naturally thanked him for his hospitality, but then he tried to explain his situation. He tried to explain that there were others like him that wanted to escape the Cygnet. Those men, though, had guns and steel. They could get those guns and swords and spears to the town. They could get enough of them to arm all of those warriors, and they would have to be armed because they were going to have to fight. The pirates of the Cygnet were definitely going to attack, and his friends, those others that wanted to escape, would help in the fight. Now that sounds fine to us who know that there was a splinter group, but the elder was suspicious. This foreigner was asking him to accept 15 or maybe 20 heavily armed men on his shore. That's a very good way to get a raiding party into town with no resistance. That rift in the crew was a sticking point. He didn't really believe that. At least, he could not afford to believe that, not with such a well-armed ship in the harbor menacing his hometown. Dampier was trying to talk his way through this, but then, as Dampier tells us, quote, "I had not been ashore an hour before Captain Teat and John Damerel with 3 or 4 armed men more, came to fetch me aboard again. I told them that I was ready to go with them, and went aboard. When I came aboard, I found the ship in an uproar, for there were 3 men more who desired to leave also. One of them was the surgeon, Mr. Coppinger, the other was Mr. Robert Hall, and one named Ambrose. These men had always harbored the same designs as I. The 2 last were not opposed, but Captain Reed and his crew would not part with the surgeon. At last the surgeon leapt into the canoe, and, taking up my gun, swore he would go ashore, and that if any man did oppose him, he would shoot. John Oliver, quartermaster, leapt into the canoe, taking hold of him, took away the gun. With the help of 2 more, they dragged him again into the ship. End quote. Dampier returned to Cygnet to find it in mayhem. 2 men, who felt very much like Dampier, were arguing that they wanted to leave, as was his friend, Herman Coppinger. Those other 2, Robert Hall and Mr. Ambrose, they were permitted to leave, as was Dampier. But Herman Coppinger was not. He was forcefully dragged back aboard, while Dampier was put on a boat and rowed to shore. One of the men who did the rowing gifted these 3 a few tools. They gave them an axe and a musket, some shot and powder to work it, and they had their effects, including Dampier's sea chest. Once ashore, they made their way to a small hut that had been offered to Dampier by the elder about an hour ago. But then, as they were settling in, another small boat rowed out from the Cygnet, and it had 5 men aboard. It was night. I doubt they would have been able to see, but I wonder if there was a moment of hope in Dampier's heart. Maybe Coppinger had talked his way off the ship. Maybe they let him go. They were close friends. Regardless of whether or not there was more to their relationship than platonic friendship, I imagine that this friend was foremost in Dampier's thoughts. However, when they got close enough, hope died. Herman Coppinger was not aboard. Instead, there was a Portuguese sailor who had been with them for some time, since shortly after leaving Mindanao, and 4 Malay men. Those Malay men were from the proa that they had captured only a couple of weeks ago. This was not a crack team of elite pirates. This was the dregs. Robert Hall could handle himself well enough, and Ambrose know his business on the sea, but Dampier was the only one with any experience at command. Naturally, that fell to his shoulders. The men bedded down for the night, and come morning, the elder there on Nicobar Island was quite surprised to see 8 men camped out on the beach rather than the agreed-upon 3. However, instead of the frigate Cygnet menacing his coastline, all they had was that one tiny ship's boat. The elder understood this situation and took these men in. Dampier's ordeal, though, was far from over. However, for now, we're going to leave Dampier on Nicobar Island. Next time, we need to turn our attention to another crew. A crew that we've met before, but have not seen in some time. Next time, we are returning to the West Indies.